and not a change in direction.
I saw that personal savings rate was 6.8% through the first quarter. That was more than double the prior reading of 3.3%. That could be an aberration, I suppose, but it's certainly a good sign.
And especially compared to zero back 10 years ago or so. But again, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, saving rate goes up, it means consumption is not as strong. So, but in the long run, a high savings rate actually is a very good thing.
But when we look at the GDP, it looked like when the personal consumption expenditures, basically what the consumer is spending out there, 70% of the economy, that was up a good solid 4%. Right. So looks like at least for that quarter, they were the higher savings and investing and consumer spending went hand in hand. And it may be some of these things that just go unnoticed. When household net worth peaked in 2007, and ever since then, there's been every article is negative. But when I go look at the most recent figures, it's $100 trillion now, the household net worth,
right? And
that's 50% higher than it was prior to the recession,
right?
And so people almost made, and the level of debt relative to their balance sheet has gone down to a 20 or 30 year low. I mean, this is pretty amazing considering a 10-year period that we've had coming off the second worst economic and stock market slide. It would have almost been unimaginable to say, by 2013, by the way, household net worth, the stock market will be at all-time new highs. And by the way, 10 years from now, from saying I'm in 2009 or so, the household net worth would be 50% higher.
And a lot of
it would have been unimaginable.
And a lot of that had to do with, for a lot of household net worth is in housing value. So that was
all-time highs.
Hit very hard with the recession because that was targeted in the housing sector. So again, it's a very, very remarkable recovery.
Doesn't that suggest? It always suggests to me, and my clients think I'm an incurable optimist, but I think I'm a realist. I think optimism is the only worldview that squares with the facts. And to me, what seemed unimaginable, just the story of the resilience of our relatively free market system and the way we protect people's property rights. Right. And sometimes we overdo regulation. That's debatable, of course. But the resiliency is unimaginable.
Right. Again, we talk about these things periodically, but we come to a situation where we still have declines in the stock market, but the recoveries have been extremely quick. We haven't had a 5 or 10 year period like we had in the 60s and 70s where nothing was happening. So again, even when it goes down, it tends to bounce back very quickly. We always give the caveat that that's not necessarily going to be true in the future, but certainly has been true the last 30 years or so.
And everybody's obsessing about, and I wrote a little bit about it in the most recent newsletter that just went out yesterday to my clients, about this inverted yield curve, because the last 7 out of 7 recessions, the yield curve inverted, which meant that short-term rates are higher than long-term rates. And then that means we're going to get a recession. No, inverted yield curves by themselves don't cause the recession. It's really a symptom of the Fed really tightening too much. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I think the doom and gloomers are probably wrong on this one.
Right.
It's not impossible we can have a recession starting tomorrow. My point is, when you look at the big picture, considering the nominal GDP's pretty strong, look where really interest rates are today. I still think the Fed's behind the curve, and they were anything but tight. And I think even if the Federal Reserve, it appears to me, if they raised interest rates on the federal funds to 3.5%, which would take 6 more tightenings by the end of 2019, still on a historical basis, not tight.
Right.
There was actually suggest maybe we have more room between now and a recession.
One of the people we often mention here is Burton Malkiel, and he had an article yesterday, the day before, in the Wall Street Journal saying that the inverted yield curve is probably not going to happen, and to the extent it's flattening, it's not necessarily a problem. So I think that's true. Again, it's not. There's no sure sign one way or another, but I don't think this is an imminent sign of something bad happening.
Yeah, it's just it's been fascinating. We've been on the right side of it. Again, we're not predictors and we're not forecasters. So I want to be clear on that. We're not saying, listen to us and we're going to be right. Mm-hmm. But I think the optimism that this idea of this trust the resilience of the U.S. consumer, of the market economy, it probably didn't pay to be pessimistic
Right.
all through this. And we know that we had net stock market liquidations until 2013. So one of the biggest parts of the bull market was between 2009 and 2013, when we finally took all-time highs. And yet investors were in net liquidation. So in aggregate, most investors missed a big front end part of this. And it just never seems to end that way.
One note also that people should realize is that good news doesn't always manifest itself in the stock market going up. For example, we had the strongest GDP growth for quite a long time, and yet people were disappointed because they expected it to be even higher, and it wasn't. So again, the fact that the economy seems to be strong, is going to continue to be strong for probably a year or so, is not necessarily a case for an explosion of stock market values, either one way or another.
But sustaining the kind of levels that we've just experienced in this quarter really is something that hasn't been done since Bill Clinton was president.
Right.
And when you think about that, that's a long time since that's happened. And so to just assume that this strong 4% GDP growth is sustainable would certainly, if you have an adult memory, you go, it turns out that's probably not so easily done and easily achieved. But I did find it amazing that a lot of these declinists that really were just trying to convince everybody for the last 7, 8, 9 years that, well, no, this is the new deal. It's 2% economy as far as the eye can see. Again, I think my view, and I mean, I could be dead wrong on this, Fred, is the government crowds out the private markets. That's really it's a big issue. I think when we go into these slow growth periods, they usually coincide with big growth in government, whether you're for it or against it. I'm not arguing one way or another. It just seems, and I don't know if there's
I think
causation there, but
also one of the reasons why they expect the slow growth is that we have a kind of a baked in growth in the government sector because of the people retiring and more going to transfers, things of that sort. So again, I think that maybe 2% is overly pessimistic.
I think so. I think we're out of that mode.
But I'd be delighted to get 3%.
Well, isn't it great that the whole financial industry is kibitzing about whether it's could be 3.5 or 4 or 2.8 or 2.9. I mean, just stepping back and say, wow, how the story has changed.
You don't hear much about only a few months ago it was deflation, and now you don't hear that at all.
No, and I wrote in a newsletter maybe a year ago that get ready for inflation, and that'll be, of course, the one thing that everybody's going to be overly hyped about coming. Inflation is ticking up, to be sure. It's at a minimum. It's at the Fed's target rate. But I still think the Fed's behind the curve. I mean, historically, if you look at a 10-year treasury, it might be about 1.8% below nominal GDP. About 0.45%. So they're usually pretty closely track the 10-year yield and nominal GDP. Here we are today at about 180 basis points, 1.8% below. Shows me that the Fed is not tight. So I'm not too concerned about that. And it's what a country we live in, guys. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit to Ryan. You recently published your first Investopedia article. And the reason we always bring up Investopedia is it's kind of the go-to worldwide place for really quality financial content. And if you can write an article that they will put on their platform, I think you've accomplished something for sure. And as I might have mentioned, if you hear our ad, Son Paul was chosen as Investopedia as one of their top 100 most influential advisors in America. So we really respect Investopedia, not just for that reason, just because it's generally accepted as a really high quality place. Well, you wrote that article and it was picked up by NASDAQ. And that was an article about financial planning tips for new parents, which shouldn't come any surprise to anybody with a 2-year-old, your first one, or 2.5-year-old, my little Texas tornado, and then another one on the way. I mean, for you, it's natural that you might write an article like this. Paul's going to share that on our company social media pages on our website, or link the comments to the Facebook live video for those of you watching on Facebook. What was the motivation behind writing this? I mean, is it just something hit you, or you just had something you've been thinking about ever since Cooper was born?
It was really just like a reflection on what it was like to have a child and then take that from the financial perspective. And I just kind of thought back on the things that I had to do and thought, some of the things I thought I did right. And one thing I know I certainly did wrong, and we'll talk about that here. But it was just a way for me to say, listen, here's a helpful guide for young parents. Anyone who's got a new child is probably a little bit overwhelmed, especially if it was your first, like it was for me. And maybe this will give a little bit of steps that you can go through to make sure that you have your T's crossed and your I's dotted as you're going into this new world as a parent and a new world financially.
And what surprised me when I read the article, yes, I do read them, was that you basically teed off with retirement planning. So to me, those two things, I'm not expecting one of the first parts of the article to be centered around retirement planning when we're talking about financial planning tips for new parents. Mm-hmm. Is that just a coincidence, or was your number one thing that you think people should think about?
I think it's important to do simply because it's a lot easier as you're younger to get in the habit of putting money away for retirement now when you have less demands and less shiny objects looking at you from Amazon or across the shelves to say,
Amazon, Amazon, isn't it the best? But it's the worst. It's the curse. Just because I can't get on Amazon and not find something that I don't need.
No, that you need.
Well, I probably don't need it, but I want it.
So it's so easy to pick up something now, to order something with 2-day shipping. And it's like, well, maybe if you had put in a little bit of safeguards in the first place by forcing yourself to live on lesser means, by having your investment retirement planning set up from the beginning, it's kind of just a little bit of a check, or even a mental check to say that I've got money that is dedicated already to retirement, and now I have to live on the rest, as opposed to maybe looking 2, 3, 4 years into having a child and say, oh, now it's time for me to get serious about storing money for retirement. It's a way for you to get ahead of the curve and not to have to work backwards.
Well, and I think retirement aside, whether you say you're saving money for retirement or not, I think the key principle is you need to make sure you're putting yourself in a good financial position. You're taking care of yourself instead of, I think it's only natural being, a parent to want to provide everything that you can to your children. And I think a lot of times that leads to parents overspending, not saving for retirement, not, saving up an emergency fund, which I think you're going to talk about, and just not taking care of themselves. And, it's kind of like the airplane analogy where they say you need to put your own mask on so that, you don't pass out and then you're unable to help your children. It's kind of the same thing. If you don't do some of these things, you could be looking, 20, 30 years down the road, and now you're depending on your children, and no one really wants that.
Yep. And your next thing was emergency fund. Would it be fair to say that's at least as important? In other words, you kind of need to be doing that at least the same time, at least tracking on building an emergency fund.
Agreed. And you should have an emergency fund before you have children too. So it goes hand in hand with retirement. Ideally, you're planning for your retirement. You're saving extra money up for an emergency fund before you have a child. But the fact that having a child kind of amplifies the importance of these things. And anyone who's a parent can agree that children are unpredictable. 1 minute you're running around the house, the next minute you've got a crying baby, and maybe you're rushing to the ER for
next minute they have a cape on and they're on the roof.
Yeah, so things escalate quickly. So
they do, and that kind of leads, I guess, in some ways to your next one, which is make sure that your insurance is in check, because it's one thing to do all these things right. You have an emergency fund, you're saving away, and then you neglect the insurance side of things. Like, okay, so now what could go wrong?
Right.
And so, when I think of your little one, how active he is, it won't be long he'll be on the roof with a cape, I suppose.
For sure.
And that was kind of your next recommendation.
Right. I mean, it's easy for you to get your children on your health insurance, assuming, of course, you have an insurance plan through maybe your work. You just call them up and you have the ability to just add them onto the plan. One thing that you have to try to remember is that your child now is its own independent person, so they have their own deductibles and out-of-pocket maximum. So it's not like you have to save the same amount of money for your retirement fund, or for your emergency fund. Now you maybe want to expand your emergency fund to include these potential extra costs that you're going to incur by having more healthcare costs. So this is an area where you simply just have to make sure you make that phone call for health insurance. Typically you have 30 to 60 days, something you certainly want to check on with your own insurance carrier because they are different, but just make sure you don't forget, because then you can be phased out from enrolling.
Fred, it used to be so much easier when we had
Right.
kids. I mean, it really so many things, I guess, were maybe more complicated.
Yeah.
Like you had to drive and read a map. Things like
Yeah.
that.
The point about the emergency fund, though, is really important. But I've just been reading that there are some plans that force lower income people into 401ks and so on. And it turns out that's not a particularly good deal unless they have an emergency fund, because they end up
Just
taking
going
money out of
robbing
their fund and paying penalties and so on. So actually having an emergency fund allows you to do these other things, like start saving for college and saving for retirement.
Does the state of Illinois have a large
They have it, but it hasn't been.
emergency fund?
They have it. No, they don't have an emergency fund, but they're going to have the kind of mandatory nudge to put people into a 401k, but that hasn't been approved yet by the IRS.
Ah.
But again, there's kind of it seems like a good idea, but it's only a good idea if you do these other things as well.
So really, a prerequisite is if you don't have an emergency fund in place, anything you do might, there's a really good chance that the first thing that pops up, now you're borrowing from your 401k, which is not a good idea as a rule. But worse yet, you're taking money out directly, paying income tax on it, all at the same time you have this either medical or emergency crisis, the water heater and the roof go at the same time.
And I just had a thought too. I know a lot of our listeners may be more in the grandparent phase.
Sure.
And maybe some of this stuff seems like common sense to them, but I see every single day people who aren't doing a lot of these things, who are, either approaching having children or have children. So for those of you people who are listening and are grandparents, maybe it's worth having a discussion with your children to make sure they have some of these basic things in place. Just kind of as a side note to all of this.
But, one of the issues is, and you've seen it, we're in the retirement business. So most of our clients grew up in the shadows of the Depression. And probably more often than not, it's a family that doesn't talk about money issues. And I don't know if you agree with that, Fred, but that's my read on it is as each 10 years go by, families seem to open up more and more about that. But it does take crossing that barrier. Do you discuss it? Did you ever discuss those kind of issues with your kids, or was it
I don't think so.
hands-off?
Not later on when they're adults, but probably not very much when they're younger. So.
Right. And I think, Dave, you're right. I think if you can, let's face it, when you're in the throes, you're getting married, then you're having children, and you're not sleeping, you may not be thinking these things. So it is a good role for a grandparent to play to say, wait a minute, do you have an emergency fund? How, you don't have to ask how much it is, but you could say, it should be 3 to 6 months of your spending, what are your crisis spending needs is. Because, you want to be able to always pay for food. You want to be able to have heat and air conditioning, and you want to have your house. And, just to make sure you have enough money to keep those, if you have a car or transportation to get to work, to continue earning a living. This all comes out of that emergency fund.
David may be overly optimistic about kids taking their parents' advice.
It might be, but maybe after enough repetition, hopefully it starts to plant that seed maybe. But you're right. They're not going to run out and say, oh, great idea. I'm going to go out and make sure that I have my emergency fund, and I'm going to start doing some real retirement planning, and I'm going to make sure I have all my insurances. I don't think I've met that person yet, that even if they were advised to do that at a young age, that did it. And that kind of leads to the next one, which you don't really think about when you think about, well, having children and all this, and let alone retirement savings. It's what about your estate plan, or really your basic documents? Making sure that, again, it's just another form of insurance, and ensuring that if something prematurely happens to you and your spouse, that everything you wanted to have done gets done. So you had that fitting in there. Do you think most people, Ryan, and what's your advice to them, and what are the go-to things that they really need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think this is an area that probably falls last or towards the bottom of the list for most new parents. And this is the area where I didn't pass the test. When I said earlier, some things I did well, one thing I really didn't do well. This is the area that I didn't do well. So I don't write this blog from the perspective that I did all this right. I wrote it from my experience. And for the purpose of listeners, you should really have a plan in place so that if something does happen to you, there is not a unknown of what happens to your children.
Okay. I see that we have a caller. John, you're on the air, on the money. Yes, John.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. I've got an IRA rollover question.
Okay.
I will be turning 59 and a half in November.
Okay.
Currently, my retirement savings are in a 401k.
Okay.
And my question is, are there any pitfalls to look for? I mean, what I want to do is roll over out of the 401k into a traditional IRA to avoid the fees I'm being charged in the 401k. But I'm not 100% sure about the withdrawal requirements. I think I understand that I can withdraw the same way I'm doing with the 401k without any penalty and any amount I want until I'm 72 and a half. But I need some guidance here.
Okay. David, why don't you handle that?
Yeah, because you're over the age of 59 and a half, you can withdraw basically as much or as little as you want up until, as you mentioned, it's actually age 70 and a half, where you have to take out a minimum amount. They call it required minimum distribution. 401ks actually operate pretty much the exact same way. The advantage of a 401k for the listeners who are a little bit younger than you are is that you can actually take withdrawals after the age 55 if you separate from service. So there's a little advantage there to some people. To you, that's not very applicable. So I don't see any downside to moving to the IRA. If you're, for people who are still working for their company, there are exceptions to required minimum distribution rules for a 401k plan. But if you're going to retire before that point, I think that's kind of a moot point for most people. So really, I don't think there are any pitfalls that you're going to fall into or anything you need to worry about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're good to
And
go.
then final question would be, Vanguard is still a top-notch place to do this, right?
I can't think of anybody, that I would say is better. We have no affiliation with them. As I said,
Right.
I always say they don't know we exist. I've just, as an observer for 35 years of watching that company and recommending that fund family, I have gotten no feedback that ever had made me regret recommending that home for people's money. What you do there is obviously between you and either yourself or an advisor there. So world-class company, thought leaders. Well, we use a firm that's very similar, Dimensional Fund Advisors. They're basically identical. We use them for a different set of reasons, but I wouldn't arm wrestle anybody between one or the other. But certainly Vanguard's available to the retail investor, and it's a wonderful place to go. And if you want to see the hair of your advisors, of a broker or an insurance person's hair on their neck go up, tell them, just say, how come we're not in Vanguard funds? And you'll watch them turn pale. So I think you have something to add to that, Ryan?
And one thing I would say, when you actually go about performing this rollover, it is good to do a direct rollover. So that way you're not taking possessions of the funds. And that way you're not due to have a big tax bill later for next year. So doing a direct rollover will help you avoid that.
And Vanguard will it'll be the easiest thing you do today.
Very good.
Okay.
Thanks so much for the help.
Right. I'm glad it helped. We're going to go to the next caller. We're going to go to Tom on line 2. Tom, welcome to On the Money.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Yes, sir.
Got a question for you. I'm 75 years old. I'm drawing Social Security. I'm also got a part-time job, which I'm paying. They're taking out of my check for Social Security. Am I eligible to draw more money?
Draw more money? You mean because you're working?
From my Social Security. Yeah.
I think he's asking if his Social Security benefit will increase because he's still working. So he's basically
that's what
paying
I'm
into the
asking.
system more years.
Will my benefit increase?
I think the answer is it depends. The benefit you receive from Social Security is going to be based on your 35 highest years of compensation adjusted for inflation. So it depends. If you didn't have 35 full years of work where you paid into Social Security, no matter what you're earning, I think it could go up. If you already had 35 years of full-time work where you were probably making more than you are now, it probably won't increase.
I did.
Yeah. So if you're at a high wage, and in other words, if your wages basically stayed the same or inflated a bit, there's a good chance that it's possible that you will end up getting a higher benefit ultimately.
But I think because he's working,
he's already been in 35 years and he's working part-time now.
So I don't expect it to go up.
If you're working part-time now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wouldn't look for it to go up then. I was thinking you were where I missed that. I thought you were working full-time and you were still collecting. then there was a chance for that. But I doubt it. I really doubt it.
Because really what it comes down to is once you've had 35 years being paid into the system, the only way you really get to step up your benefit amount is if you earn more this year than your lowest of the 35 prior years you worked. So you're kind of replacing a lower earning year with a higher earning year. I can't imagine that's the case working part-time.
It doesn't make sense that I'm paying in and I can't get more.
Well,
so can I tell my employer don't take out any more income tax?
Well, the good news is in the old days, you probably would have had your Social Security reduced because of your work, and now you don't.
So at least now that you're as a full retirement age, they're not dinging you for it. And so at least you're not getting penalized for it. And I hear what you're saying. There's a lot of people, you put your place in somebody who's taught at a university or worked at a university level, but maybe they paid into Social Security for 5 or 10 years. They basically don't get much of a benefit at all for having done that work. So it's certainly not an equal fairness out there.
So with the Social Security system, it's pay me now or pay me later, right?
I suppose, but a lot of people will come into my office and they don't think of their Social Security as all that valuable of an income stream. They'll say, well, it's only $1,500 a month or it's $2,000 a month. That's not really. And I always translate it into how much money would a person have to have in Treasury inflation protected securities to generate an inflation adjusted income of that sort. And it's in the million.
Right.
It's in the millions of dollars. So Tom, you're a millionaire.
Yeah.
You just didn't know it.
And it also is paid for the rest of your life, and that's hugely valuable as
Great
like a
longevity
hedge.
insurance.
Yeah.
So if back in the day when I first started paying Social Security after I got out of the military, if instead of paying that, I'd have put into a 401k or something, I'd probably have a couple $1 million, right?
Some could do a calculation and make certain assumptions that show that for many people they would be better off, but for many maybe not so much. It really depends on so many things, Tom. As far as it really takes somebody to not only do the investing, but to allocate it properly and then to behave properly. That's kind of like asking a dog to be a cat. It's my belief that to be human, human nature is a failed investor. And that's why probably for a lot of people, that Social Security check is probably higher than that they would have accumulated themselves. So it's possible. It's possible to outdo it for sure. I mean, if it was up to me, I would have done that personally, if that was a choice. But for a lot of people, I see the difficulty that people have just by being humans and the emotional nature of that. That I'm not sure how well that would end unless it was, Fred, for a while they talked about making some of it private.
Right.
To that extent, if the government, instead of buying just bonds behind it or synthetic bonds, IOUs, if they invested in, say, just the total market index, it could make a pretty persuasive article that would have improved the Social Security system.
Well, it's a very complicated issue, though. But if you or I do that, it doesn't affect the market. But if you threw the whole Social Security pot in there, it's going to be a lot of unpredictable kinds of outcomes there. So again, if you go back a long ways, the people early on did extremely well on Social Security. The people probably the age of the caller broke even or maybe did better. People the age of Ryan and David aren't going to do as well as they put in.
Would you say, Fred, if we 100 years from now, we look back, that Tom and people like Tom probably caught the sweet spot of Social Security?
Right.
That's my belief, Tom. I think going forward for the youngins, I'm not so sure they're going to get your deal.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for calling, Tom.
You bet.
We are now going to go to Rob on line 1. Rob, welcome to On the Money. Rob, are you there? I'll try it again. Right, yeah, Rob, gotcha.
Okay. I work for the federal government, and I had a question about TSP account.
Yes, sir.
I've got 15% in a traditional IRA.
Okay.
And I was told it'd be a good idea to also start a Roth IRA account. So I starting to put 5% into that.
Now you're still talking about your TSP. So you're saying in your TSP, you have a traditional portion, It's not really an IRA, but I know what you meant, but I want to make clear for the callers. And there's a Roth provision that says you can also put some of your money where it's not tax-free up front, but as long as you follow the rules, you don't get a deduction up front, but the money you pull out is tax-free. Okay. So,
yeah, that's correct. So 15% of the traditional, and then added the 5% on the Roth. Does that sound like a reasonable thing to do? I'm 57. I'm going to retire at 65.
It seems like, look, there's no right answer here. Okay. I like to hedge my bets. So, if somebody could tell me a couple of things, what their tax bracket's going to be in the future precisely, and what it is now, I can tell you which way to go 100%. I don't think anybody who's sane would say that they absolutely dispositively know what their future tax brackets are going to be. My guess is, I find that for retirees, taxation is really favorable, particularly in the state of Illinois, which shocks people because so much of your income isn't taxed in Illinois as a retiree. So I think you're going to find, if you're like most people, at least the first, Dave, 3 to 5 to 7 years, you might be in a very low tax bracket. So your chances are, I like the idea of hedging it. I guess that's I'm going down a long path. I'm going to stop myself and say, if you said it was, half in traditional and half in the other. Now, what would you say your marginal tax bracket is today? Do you know?
Would it be like 28%?
Okay. So I like the way you're doing it. I think I'm at 28% marginal tax bracket, Dave. I kind of like your mix. I like the idea of, hey, we don't know, so we're going to put some in the Roth provision, a quarter of it, and 3/4 of your money going in traditional. It's probably sensible.
The good news too is that the federal plan is one of the best there is. They have really good low cost investment options. This is getting a technical point. I'm not even less of an advisor than Paul, but
nobody's less of an advisor than me. That's what Dave says.
You might think about, if it's possible, to keep putting it in the regular one and then transfer your existing funds into the Roth, because you wouldn't have to pay the state tax on that.
Oh, yes, I agree. That's probably something you want to discuss with your CPA, but it certainly is doable, and it's certainly not talking to your CPA because it's fuzzy. It's just to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what Fred's saying. Another thing, though, and I think if you, Rob, if you heard us outside of this studio talking about this issue, one of us is going to say, whether you put how much in a Roth versus traditional is really not the difference maker in the end. It doesn't move the quality of retirement needle, the how soon the retirement comes needle very much at all. It's really the important question. The most important question is how, and I'm not asking you how you're allocated, but for you to think about how you are allocated in that thrift savings plan. That is much more of a driver of the next 2 to 3 decades of your lifestyle than any other issue. The Roth versus traditional decision is almost irrelevant, at least in my view. You guys can chime in, but to me, that is the real valuable question, and the answer to that is the most valuable part.
Well, I can tell you, I'm 80% in the C fund and 10% in the S fund and 10% in the I fund.
Okay, well, C fund that's the corporate bonds.
Yep.
Okay.
It's common stock.
Oh, common stock. I'm not going to argue with that one. When are you going to retire roughly, if you feel comfortable?
8 years.
Okay. I don't have any issues with that. Now, that wouldn't be textbook, guys. It would be, well, you should probably start moving more towards a balance, because I heard you said 80% in the C fund.
Yep.
10%
S&I, 10%. Yep.
Yeah.
So small cap.
Yep. So
and international.
Okay. So here's one thing to think about. And the more research I do, personal research, not just reading other people's research, really deep dives into this when we're getting towards retirement and after retirement. And first, I would say the 3 to 5 years prior to retirement and 3 to 5 years, first 3 to 5 years in retirement. I really don't want you being 80% or 90% in the stock market. I really don't. Mm-hmm. So I think as you get within 5 years, I would almost instantly, as a default, go to a 50-50 position. Not permanently, Rob, not permanently. I could even argue that you go to 40% in the stock market, 60%, and build this, what I call a bond tent. It's because, and the reason I'm saying this is what happens, you've never had more money than you'll have well, other than that, 5 years into retirement, 3 years up towards retirement, you're going to have probably more money than you've ever had. So you're susceptible to significant declines in the stock market. Even though they're temporary, we'll always talk about them being temporary, it can have an impact when we start thinking about we're going to need to withdraw and de-accumulate from these accounts.
What if we don't need to withdraw till what? We're forced to at 70.5?
Then I'm comfortable with where you are. I'm very comfortable with where you are, with the caveat that you understand and you look back and you lived through 2008, 2009.
Yep.
That's a big outlier. I'm not going to suggest it couldn't experience something worse between now and then, but
Sure.
if you can handle that and keep your head keep your head with you, I have no concerns. A lot of people can't, so that's why the industry tends to default to really boring portfolios, even permanently throughout retirement. I don't do that. I defy that common idea. But as long as you can emotionally handle it, Dave, go ahead. You have a comment.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to think about is the fact that you're not needing to take withdrawals from your investment portfolio suggests you have other significant income streams. And for people who are listening, you can count income streams such as like guaranteed pension income or Social Security income as fixed income.
Right.
I mean, that's really
Synthetic.
what it is at its essence.
Yep.
And so if you look at that as fixed income and you basically count that towards the stable portion of your portfolio, it's covering your expenses, then you really have the freedom to take that. You could be 100% stock, but if you mix everything together and you count that income stream as fixed income, your overall portfolio, in quotes, looks more balanced. And that's kind of where Rob's going to end up.
I'm comfortable with where you are. Actually, I love it. And with my caveat, sounds like you can pass the fluctuation isn't going to bother me. I'm not going to do something that I'm going to regret. In the face of that, I'm very comfortable.
And 20% is a very heavy savings rate too.
Oh yeah, you got a heavy savings rate. You're doing everything right. You get an A+ and you get to sit in the front of the class.
All right, I appreciate you.
Great to talk to you.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
We are going to Frank on line 2. Frank, welcome to On the Money.
Thank you. I also have a Social Security question.
Yes, sir.
Could you have somebody explain the windfall elimination provision?
Yeah, David, I know you spend quite a bit of time. There's a couple different provisions that we get. Sometimes our brain goes back and forth, the windfall elimination and the government pension offset.
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked at it. And like you said, it's easy to get them tripped up. But the windfall elimination provision, if I'm remembering correctly, is basically a reduction to your own benefits. If you're eligible for benefits because you paid into Social Security at some point in your lifetime. But then you went and you worked for somewhere like the University of Illinois where you're not paying into Social Security. And what they essentially do is reduce your stated Social Security benefit, like the amount you'll see on your statement will actually be overstated. They're going to reduce that by a certain amount. And it's kind of a convoluted formula because what they do is they reduce the percentage of it's called average index monthly earnings that they replace. I believe that's correct. It
is now, and again, if you've worked 30 years prior to you working for a system where you're not covered under Social Security, basically so if you only work 10 years of Social Security, you're going to get more of a haircut.
Right.
Yeah, and this is an area where there's a lot of unhappiness, not surprisingly, with retirees, especially. I deal with a lot of people who are SERS retirees, and the lot, unlike a lot of government programs, there actually is a logic here. If you work for a organization like the University of Illinois or the state of Illinois, where you don't pay into Social Security, that's supposed to substitute for it. So, for example, in my case, I get a pension from the University of Illinois, which is a very solid sort of thing. But from Social Security standpoint, I would look like a relatively poor person because I had a few $1,000s a year in non-university income over a long period of time. And the Social Security system rewards low-income people. They pay them at a higher rate than others. So I would look like a low-income person, even though I'm not. And so what they do is try to eliminate that so-called windfall. So it's not a pleasant thing, and people are very unhappy, and they're even more unhappy because the Social Security Administration doesn't tell you that when they send out their estimates of your.
They do have a calculator online that you can use. If you look on SSA.gov and you look, they'll have a WEP adjusted benefit calculator. And so,
well, I have a issue what I and others call a first impression financial double jeopardy. In other words, as teachers, from some of our earnings as teachers, and as you know, teachers like university employees do not participate in Social Security.
Right.
Because if they do, if they have Social Security, their Social Security benefits are penalized because they receive a pension from a system where they didn't pay into Social Security, but not in Illinois and teacher retirement system. For example, from some of my earnings as a teacher, I was told it was federal law that I had to pay into Social Security, then I couldn't contribute to the teacher retirement system. So on one hand, my teacher retirement system my pension is penalized because I was not allowed to contribute to the teacher retirement system from all my earnings as a teacher. And on the other hand, my Social Security benefits are penalized because I receive a pension from the Illinois teacher retirement system. Financial double jeopardy. And so that, this is kind of a deal where it's a solution to all pension problems. The state requires you to violate federal law, and the federal government penalizes you for violating federal law. What that shakes out to me is this: my Social Security benefits were established from 4 years in the military and from 30 years of summer school teaching. My Social Security benefits that I earned as in military are penalized because I receive a pension from the teacher retirement system.
Yep.
The Social Security benefits I receive as a teacher are penalized because I receive a pension from the teacher retirement system.
Right. The federal rules are.
No, you're trying to cut me off. This is a scam that needs to be looked into. And I don't know why you guys do not look into it. Why were teachers allowed or compelled not to contribute to their teacher retirement system? Tell me that.
I'm not familiar with that.
No, there is one potential out. If you have 30 years of substantial earnings.
That's substantial earnings. He didn't earn substantial earnings in the summertime.
Okay, so if you have 30 years of substantial earnings, this would not apply to you.
But I didn't.
Yeah, he's just saying his weren't substantial earnings because they weren't substantial.
I was required to acquire non-substantial earnings, which took the teacher retirement system off the hook. And by the way, the elephant in the room is we were compelled to acquire Medicare. And so all of our earnings, all of our claims that we submit for our health coverage first goes through Medicare, not teacher retirement system. How about looking into it?
I would. Hey, will you call me? Not this week because I'm heading on vacation after this show. But if you'll, and feel free to call in the office this week and you can talk to my son, Dave, or Ryan. You're hitting me with something I'm not exactly familiar with. So that's why you might get some quietness out of me for the first time, quietness. Educate me a little bit about your exact issue so that we can study it up a bit. Would you do that? 356-1400?
It's very straightforward. As a teacher, I was compelled not to contribute to the teacher retirement system.
All right. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so we're going to move on. We'll certainly look into that. Thanks. And last but not least, Gary on line 3. Welcome to On the Money, Gary.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
If the stock market goes to where, and then you're taking out your required minimum distribution per year, do they recalculate that if all of a sudden your assets are worth half what they were?
Well, the next year.
The next year it would.
In
other words, it's going to catch up because it's based on the end of the year balance. So if towards the end of the year it's lower, you say, wow, I took more than I would have had to take. Well, next year is going to be based on that lower amount at the end of the year.
Okay, so they do recalculate it then.
In essence, yes, there is an adjustment for it. It follows along. It tracks with it, maybe not perfectly. Maybe the day you take it out might be the low of the year compared to where it is at the end of the year. But essentially, if you think of it as on a smoothing out basis, it is built into the system where lower balances, you take out fewer dollars from your required minimum distribution. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, it does. I was kind of hoping that's the way it was, but I didn't know.
Yes, sir. It sure is.
All right.
All right, Gary. Thanks for calling. Well, guys, we got a few minutes left. That was a flurry of phone calls. I think we gave at least helpful answers. I like to think so. Fred, I really wasn't clear on Frank's issue. I'll think through it some.
Well, I think it
sounded like it was something unique, but then he's saying, this is not unique.
Well, I think the problem is, regardless of how unfair it is, it's not nothing that a planner can do anything about. It's a federal law, and there are organizations, people who are unhappy like Frank, who are trying to overturn that, but it's nothing that an individual can do. It has to be done through the legislative process, which is not a very promising avenue.
But does it resonate why somebody might be irritated
Sure.
about that? I mean,
I mean,
you might not think you might disagree and say
Yeah.
it's not unfair. It's kind of,
No, people are, almost everyone is irritated. If you go to service annuitants
okay.
to a person, they're probably unhappy about
And
this.
but not every state does this, correct?
No, only states like Ohio, Illinois, a few other states.
Is it what's unique about those states? Are they not
Yeah,
putting money into Social Security,
yeah,
or some of them are doing the same thing, but they're not
Yeah.
making that adjustment?
Well, back when Social Security came into being and was expanding, states were given an option for their employees not to participate in Social Security. And once you did that, you didn't take out the money, and you can't. So that's the way it is in a few states, in particular Ohio and Illinois.
But for the first time, you said something where it made sense to me, is when you said the way they replace a much larger portion of what they call a low earner's income. And so if you didn't work full time and you just worked for 4 or 5 or 6 years on paper in isolation, you look like somebody who's a low earner, I guess is the best way to say it.
Same thing. If you're a university employee who's appropriately compensated and you get a few $1,000s a year in consulting, outside of that, Social Security is going to see you as a person with $5,000 or $10,000 a year income, and they'll treat you like other people who have that income, and you get a higher return, and they didn't want to do that. So that's the reason for the windfall elimination.
So am I right then, as I think through that, thinking it's maybe not as unfair as I thought it was?
It was unfair to Frank in a sense that, if I understood him right, that he was part of his income was part of the retirement situation, and they didn't pay him in the they paid him in the summer in a different way and made him pay Social Security, and that didn't go into his teacher's pension, and it didn't really help him very much in regard to Social Security.
That's his double jeopardy. Okay, now when you explain it, it makes sense. That's why,
that's
why Fred's here.
So it's unfair, but there's nothing that can be done save going to the Congress and getting them to change their rules.
And I at least understand the reasons behind it now, whether we deem them as fair or unfair. I at least get now a concept for the first time of, oh, okay, I see why they're making that adjustment because of this replacement issue and these bend points. It's the wealthier people get much.
And the federal government never does anything perfectly. It's not surprisingly.
Really? I don't think hey, we got a good military. I know that, and a great police force. I know that. Well, guys, we're going to be back. Oh gosh, I don't know when we're coming back. We'll be back in
2 weeks.
2 weeks, and we'll be back in 2 weeks for more of Paul Ruedi's On the Money. Thanks for listening, and thanks for all the great phone calls today. Thanks for listening.
Join us for the second